I lost my job on a Thursday afternoon in November. The meeting lasted 17 minutes from start to finish, and by the time I walked out of that conference room, my career at Garrison Financial, the company where I'd worked for 8 years and built what I thought was an unshakable professional reputation, was over. I was the director of corporate strategy, a position I'd earned through years of consistent performance and successful execution of complex projects that had saved the company millions in operational costs and identified acquisition opportunities that had driven significant shareholder value. My salary was $212,000 base, plus bonus potential that typically added another $40,000 to $50,000 depending on company performance and my individual contributions. I managed a team of 6 analysts, all smart and capable people I'd recruited and developed, and I reported directly to Richard Marsh, the CFO, who I'd worked with closely for the past 3 years. The position came with real responsibility and meaningful impact on the company's direction. I evaluated potential acquisitions, analyzing financial models and strategic fit to determine whether targets were worth pursuing. I led operational improvement initiatives, working with department heads across the company to identify inefficiencies and implement solutions. I prepared materials for board presentations, distilling complex financial and strategic information into clear recommendations that helped guide executive decision-making. It was demanding work that required long hours and constant availability, but it was also genuinely interesting and professionally rewarding. I felt like I was contributing something valuable, using my skills and experience to help a substantial company make better decisions. The termination came without any warning whatsoever. No performance improvement plan outlining areas where I needed to develop or improve, no documented concerns about my work quality or leadership effectiveness, no one-on-one conversation with Richard expressing dissatisfaction or suggesting that my position might be at risk. Nothing in any of my regular check-ins or team meetings that indicated anything was wrong or that changes were being contemplated. Just a calendar invite that appeared on my schedule at 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. Personnel meeting, confidential, scheduled for 2:30, with Amanda Torres from HR and Richard Marsh listed as attendees. The meeting location was Conference Room 4B, one of the smaller rooms on the executive floor that was typically used for private conversations rather than team meetings or client presentations. I felt uneasy when I saw the invite, but I told myself it was probably routine. Maybe a reorganization announcement that would affect my team structure, maybe a new project Richard wanted to discuss with HR support for hiring additional analysts, maybe something related to compensation planning for the upcoming year. When I walked into the conference room at 2:30 exactly, both Amanda and Richard were already seated with a manila folder of documents positioned between them on the table. The folder was face down, so I couldn't see what it contained, but its presence suggested this was formal and prepared rather than an impromptu conversation. Amanda did most of the talking, while Richard sat with his hands folded on the table, his face carefully blank in the way senior executives practice when delivering bad news they don't want to discuss in detail or defend. He wouldn't look directly at me, keeping his eyes fixed on the folder or on Amanda, or on some point on the wall behind my shoulder. She explained in the calm, measured tone that HR professionals use for difficult conversations that the company was making strategic organizational changes designed to improve efficiency and reduce redundancy in certain operational areas. My position as Director of Corporate Strategy was being eliminated as part of this broader restructuring initiative. The decision was final and had been approved by the executive leadership team. My employment would end effective immediately, today, as soon as this meeting concluded. The company would provide 8 weeks of severance pay, calculated based on my current salary and delivered according to the normal payroll schedule. My health insurance would continue through the end of the calendar year at the company's expense. I would also have access to an outplacement firm that specialized in executive-level career transitions, providing resume review, interview coaching, and networking support for up to 6 months. I asked why my position specifically was being eliminated, what redundancy existed, what other roles were being cut as part of this restructuring. Amanda said she couldn't discuss the details of the broader reorganization due to confidentiality concerns, but assured me this wasn't a reflection on my performance or capabilities. It was simply a business decision driven by the company's strategic priorities. I looked at Richard, trying to get him to explain what was really happening. We'd worked together for 3 years. I'd delivered every project he'd assigned, exceeded every goal, contributed to board presentations that had been praised by the executive team. He finally met my eyes for a brief second and said quietly, "The decision has been made. I'm sorry." Security was waiting outside the conference room to escort me back to my office. I had 30 minutes to pack my personal belongings while they watched. My company laptop, phone, and access badge had to be surrendered before I left the building. My colleagues watched from their desks as I packed a box with framed photos, a coffee mug, some notebooks, No one said anything. They all knew what was happening, had probably been warned to expect my departure. I drove home in a daze, my mind struggling to process what had just happened and what it meant for every aspect of my life. My career trajectory that I'd been building for 15 years since graduate school. My family's financial security that depended heavily on my income. My professional identity and sense of self-worth that were deeply tied to my role and accomplishments at Garrison Financial. All of it had been swept away in a 17-minute meeting with no warning, no explanation beyond vague references to strategic restructuring, and no opportunity to defend myself or question the decision. My wife, Catherine, was home when I arrived around 4 in the afternoon, earlier than I normally would have returned from the office. She was working from her laptop at the kitchen table, reviewing a marketing proposal for one of her small business clients. She was a marketing consultant who worked mostly with local businesses that needed help with branding, social media strategy, and customer acquisition. She earned around $60,000 a year from various client projects, enough to contribute meaningfully to our household, but nowhere near enough to sustain our lifestyle on her own if my income disappeared. I set my box of belongings down on the counter and told her what had happened, that I'd been terminated, that my position was being eliminated as part of some kind of restructuring, that it was effective immediately, and I'd already been escorted out of the building. I explained about the severance pay and health insurance continuation, trying to sound calm and factual even though I was still processing the shock. I said we needed to start thinking seriously about our finances and monthly budget until I could find a new position. I expected shock at minimum, concern about what this meant for us financially, maybe some reassurance that we'd figure it out together, that my skills and experience would help me find something new relatively quickly, that we had some savings to bridge the gap and would be okay if we were careful. That's what partners do when one of them faces an unexpected setback. They provide support, express confidence, help process the emotions, and develop a plan for moving forward. Instead, Catherine laughed. Not a brief, nervous chuckle in response to shocking news. Not an uncomfortable reaction born from not knowing what to say. A genuine, sustained laugh, sharp and contemptuous, carrying an edge of satisfaction and vindication. The kind of sound you make when someone confirms something you've been thinking all along, when reality finally aligns with your private assessment that you'd been keeping to yourself out of politeness or social convention. She said, "You should have seen this coming. You always thought you were so essential to them, so valuable and indispensable. Turns out you were just another line item on the budget they could cut whenever it was convenient." I stood there still holding my box of office belongings, a framed photo of us from our wedding, a coffee mug with the company logo, some notebooks full of project notes and meeting records, trying to understand what I was hearing from my wife, the person I'd been married to for 6 years, the person who was supposed to be my partner and closest supporter through both good times and difficult circumstances. She continued, and if anything, her tone became more gleeful, more pointed in its cruelty. "You were making over $200,000 a year, in a senior director position, managing important projects, and they still got rid of you without a second thought. That tells you everything you need to know about how replaceable you really were. All those late nights you spent working on board presentations, all those weekends you sacrificed to finish projects on tight deadlines, all that time and energy you invested in proving how dedicated and valuable you were, and they still cut you loose the moment it suited their purposes." I realized in that moment, standing in our kitchen with afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows and my career in pieces around me, that this wasn't just a lack of support or a tactless reaction to stressful news. This was active contempt. This was pleasure at my failure. This was vindication of beliefs she'd apparently held for years about my actual worth versus my self-perception. Catherine had been waiting for something like this. Some definitive evidence that I wasn't as competent or valuable as I believed myself to be. Some proof that would give her permission to express feelings she'd been holding back throughout our marriage. My sudden and unexplained termination gave her exactly that permission, and she was seizing it with enthusiasm. Before we get into what happened next, don't forget to like and subscribe, and hit hype to boost this episode. Drop a comment below with your city or country. I'm always curious where viewers are joining from. What really happened over the following days and weeks as I tried to process the termination and figure out my next steps both professionally and emotionally, I started piecing together what had actually led to my firing. The official explanation about strategic restructuring and position elimination didn't hold up under even the most basic scrutiny once I stepped back and examined it objectively. First, and most obviously, no other positions in my department or in adjacent departments had been eliminated as part of any restructuring. The company had made no public announcement about organizational changes, headcount reduction, or cost-cutting initiatives. There was no all-hands meeting where executives explained the rationale for restructuring or outlined the impact on different teams. My team of 6 analysts remained completely intact, still employed, still working on the same projects, just reporting temporarily to Richard's assistant director while they searched for a permanent replacement for my role. If the stated goal had been to improve efficiency or reduce redundancy, cutting one director position while keeping all 6 supporting analysts made absolutely no financial sense and delivered minimal cost savings relative to the company's overall budget. Second, my employment history and performance record at Garrison Financial had been consistently excellent across all 8 years. I'd received positive annual reviews without exception, with most years rating me as exceeds expectations in all evaluated categories. My most recent review, completed just 5 months earlier in June, had praised my strategic thinking, my leadership of the corporate strategy team, and my ability to deliver high-quality work under tight deadlines. That review had included a 4% merit salary increase and a bonus payout of $42,000. Both signals that the company valued my contributions and saw me as a strong performer worth retaining and rewarding. There had been no warnings about performance concerns at any point, no feedback sessions where Richard or anyone else in leadership had suggested I needed to improve in specific areas, no performance improvement plan documenting deficiencies and outlining expectations for correction. No indication in any one-on-one meetings, team meetings, or project reviews that my work quality, my leadership approach, or my strategic judgment were falling short of company standards. Third, and most significantly when I started really examining the timeline, my termination had coincided with a situation that had been developing over the previous 3 to 4 months involving Richard Marsh and Jennifer Cho, the company's VP of Human Resources. I'd become aware through a combination of direct observations and conversations with colleagues that the two of them were involved in a personal relationship, an affair that was being conducted discreetly but wasn't entirely secret, from people who worked closely with either of them. Both Richard and Jennifer were married to other people. Richard's wife Susan worked as a nurse at a local hospital, and they had 2 teenage children. Jennifer's husband Kevin was a software engineer at a tech startup downtown. The affairs weren't casual or ambiguous. This was a sustained relationship that had been going on for at least 6 months, based on what I'd observed and heard, involving regular meetings and communications that went well beyond what normal professional interactions required. I'd never confronted either Richard or Jennifer about the relationship. I'd never reported it through HR or compliance channels, partly because Jennifer was the head of HR and reporting to her about her own conduct seemed pointless, and partly because I viewed their personal lives as their own business that didn't directly affect me or my work. But I'd become increasingly uncomfortable over time with how the relationship was affecting business decisions, particularly around personnel matters and HR policies that seemed to benefit Richard's preferences in ways that weren't entirely appropriate or professionally defensible. There had been at least 3 instances in the months before my termination where Richard had successfully advocated for personnel decisions that Jennifer then approved, despite those decisions raising questions among other executives or creating perceptions of favoritism. An underperforming director in Richard's finance organization had been retained despite missing targets for 2 consecutive quarters, when similar performance from directors in other departments had led to termination or forced resignation. A salary adjustment for one of Richard's direct reports had been approved at a level substantially higher than company guidelines would normally support. A promotion within finance had been fast-tracked despite the candidate not meeting the standard tenure requirements for advancement. Each of these decisions individually could be explained or justified through various rationales. But collectively, they created a pattern suggesting that Richard's judgment on personnel matters was receiving preferential treatment from HR, and that Jennifer's relationship with him was influencing her professional decisions in ways that created conflicts of interest and potential liability for the company. About 6 weeks before my termination, there had been an incident in an executive meeting where a board member had asked pointed questions about the company's policies on conflicts of interest and personal relationships among senior leadership. The questions seemed directed at Richard and Jennifer, though the board member never named anyone specifically. Richard had deflected with vague assurances about robust compliance procedures and appropriate disclosure requirements. I'd been in that meeting taking notes for a strategic planning discussion. I'd seen Richard's reaction, the way his jaw tightened and his tone became defensive. I'd noticed Jennifer, who was sitting in the back of the room as an observer, go pale and excuse herself to take a phone call that probably didn't exist. After the meeting, Richard had asked me directly if I'd ever mentioned anything about his personal life to the board member or to anyone outside the company. I'd told him honestly that I hadn't. He'd seemed relieved, but also clearly worried about who might have raised concerns or what information might be circulating among the board. Looking back after my termination, I realized that Richard had probably decided I was too much of a risk to keep around. Not because I'd done anything wrong, or because my position was redundant, but because I knew about his affair with the VP of Human Resources. and that knowledge made me a potential threat if anyone ever investigated the relationship or its impact on business decisions. My termination had nothing to do with my performance or the company's strategic priorities. It was about removing someone who had information that could create problems for Richard if the affair became a formal compliance issue. The choice. In the first few days after losing my job, I was angry. Furious, actually. I'd worked hard for 8 years, delivered consistent results, earned my position and my salary through legitimate contributions to the company's success. And I'd been fired essentially as collateral damage in Richard's effort to protect himself from scrutiny about his inappropriate relationship with a senior HR executive. My initial impulse was to fight back publicly, to send an email to the board explaining what had really happened, to post on LinkedIn about being wrongfully terminated to cover up executive misconduct, to contact an employment lawyer and file a lawsuit for wrongful termination and retaliation, to make sure Richard and Jennifer faced consequences for using their positions to eliminate someone who posed a threat to their secret. Catherine encouraged this approach, though not out of support for me. She seemed almost excited by the prospect of drama, of me making a scene, of public conflict that would prove her assessment that I'd always been more bluster than substance. She said I should make them pay for what they did, but the way she said it suggested she expected me to fail, to embarrass myself through desperate and ineffective attempts to challenge people with more power and better lawyers. I almost did it. I drafted emails, researched employment attorneys, composed LinkedIn posts that detailed the affair and the suspicious timing of my termination. But something stopped me before I sent any of it. I realized that emotional reactions, no matter how justified, would weaken my credibility. If I went public with accusations of wrongful termination to cover up an affair, I'd sound bitter, vindictive, like someone making excuses for being fired. Richard and the company would respond with carefully crafted statements about respecting privacy while defending their business decisions. Their PR and legal teams would portray me as a disgruntled former employee spreading unsubstantiated rumors. Even if what I was saying was completely true, the way I said it would determine whether anyone believed me or took me seriously. So I made a different choice. I decided to let process, not anger, do the work. To document everything I knew and everything that had happened, and to submit that documentation through proper channels where people whose job was to investigate these things could evaluate it professionally. The action. I started my documentation process by submitting a formal written request to Garrison Financial's HR department for a complete copy of my personnel file. Under California state law, employees and former employees have an explicit right to inspect and receive copies of their personnel records within 30 days of making a written request. The law is very specific about this. Employers must provide the files, must do so in a timely manner, and can face penalties for non-compliance or unnecessary delays. I drafted a professional letter explaining that I was exercising my rights under California Labor Code Section 1198.5 to request my complete personnel file, including all performance reviews, disciplinary documentation, communications related to my employment and termination, and any other records that the company maintained regarding my work history. I sent the letter via both email to the HR department's general inbox and certified mail with return receipt requested to the company's legal department, creating a paper trail that documented exactly when I'd made the request and ensuring they couldn't claim they'd never received it. The file arrived exactly 2 weeks later, delivered via FedEx in a large envelope containing approximately 150 pages of photocopied documents. I spent an entire afternoon going through everything methodically, making notes on timeline and content, cross-referencing different documents to identify patterns or inconsistencies. What I found was simultaneously validating and infuriating. The file confirmed everything I already knew about my performance, but also revealed how completely my termination had been fabricated as a business necessity rather than based on any legitimate concerns about my work. My performance reviews going back 8 years to my initial hire were uniformly positive. Every single annual review rated me as either meets expectations or exceeds expectations across all evaluated dimensions: strategic thinking, analytical capabilities, leadership and team development, communication skills, project execution, and collaboration with other departments. The reviews included specific examples of my contributions, detailed comments from Richard and from previous supervisors before he became CFO, and consistent recognition of my value to the organization. There were no written warnings anywhere in the file. No emails documenting concerns about missed deadlines or quality issues. No performance improvement plans outlining areas where I needed to develop or correct deficiencies. No disciplinary notices. No records of complaints from colleagues or other executives about my professional conduct. Nothing that would provide any legitimate basis for terminating my employment based on performance or behavior. The termination paperwork itself was remarkably sparse. Just a 2-page form signed by Richard and countersigned by Jennifer, stating that my position was being eliminated effective November 14th as part of organizational restructuring to improve operational efficiency. There was no attached business case explaining what inefficiencies existed or how eliminating my role would address them. No financial analysis showing the cost savings or resource reallocation. No organizational chart demonstrating how responsibilities would be redistributed. Just a bare assertion that restructuring was happening and my position was part of it. I also found something interesting that I hadn't expected. Buried in the file was an email exchange from mid-September between Richard and Jennifer discussing leadership transitions in corporate strategy. The emails were vague, carefully worded to avoid saying anything explicitly incriminating, but the timing and context were revealing. The exchange had taken place about 6 weeks before my termination, shortly after the board meeting where questions about conflicts of interest had been raised. Richard's email to Jennifer said something like, "We should discuss appropriate timing and process for making necessary changes in corporate strategy leadership. Want to make sure we handle this correctly from an HR procedural standpoint." Jennifer's response agreed and suggested they schedule a private meeting to discuss options and timeline. That exchange confirmed that my termination had been planned and coordinated between Richard and Jennifer weeks before it actually happened, and that they'd been conscious of the need to handle it correctly from a procedural standpoint to avoid creating obvious legal exposure. Next, I compiled a detailed timeline covering the 6 months leading up to my termination. The document ran to 7 single-spaced pages, organized chronologically with specific dates and descriptions of observable events. I stuck to facts, avoiding speculation or emotional characterization, just documenting what happened and when. August 15th, executive meeting where board member raised questions about conflicts of interest policies. Richard Marsh and Jennifer Cho, both present. August 16th, private conversation with Richard Marsh where he asked if I'd discussed his personal life with anyone outside the company. September 12th, executive leadership reorganization announced. Jennifer Cho promoted from VP of Human Resources to Chief People Officer, expanding her authority over all personnel decisions. September 28th. Regular one-on-one meeting with Richard Marsh canceled without explanation. First time in 3 years this had happened. October 5th. Excluded from strategic planning meeting I normally would have attended. Told by Richard's assistant that the agenda had changed and my input wasn't needed. October 23rd. Received performance review rating me as exceeding expectations in all categories. Merit increase and bonus approved. November 8th. Informed by Richard in casual conversation that he appreciated my discretion and professionalism. Exact words. "I know you understand how to keep business matters confidential." November 14th. Terminated. Position eliminated due to strategic restructuring. No advance notice. No documentation of reorganization plan. The timeline told a clear story without requiring me to make any accusations or speculate about motives. It simply presented facts that raised obvious questions about whether the termination decision had been made for legitimate business reasons. I also gathered emails and meeting notes from my company laptop before surrendering it. I'd been careful to forward key documents to my personal email account during the 30 minutes I had to pack my office. These included communications showing my successful project work, positive feedback from colleagues and clients, and the board presentation materials I'd prepared that had been well received by senior leadership. Finally, I drafted a formal complaint to submit to Garrison Financial's compliance department. The document was 3 pages, single-spaced, written in calm and professional language that avoided emotional characterizations or personal attacks. The complaint outlined my concerns that my termination might not have been based on legitimate business reasons, but rather on my knowledge of a personal relationship between 2 senior executives that created potential conflicts of interest in personnel decisions. I documented the timeline of events, noted the lack of performance-based justification for the termination, and requested that the company's compliance function review whether proper procedures had been followed and whether any conflicts of interest had influenced the decision. I submitted the complaint through Garrison Financial's Anonymous Ethics Hotline, a third-party service the company provided for employees to report concerns about potential misconduct or policy violations. The system allowed reporters to check on the status of their complaint using a unique reference number without having to identify themselves. I also sent a copy directly to the company's general counsel via certified mail, documenting that I'd raised these concerns formally and through proper channels. Everything was factual. Everything was documented. I made no accusations beyond requesting an investigation into whether proper procedures had been followed. I let the facts speak for themselves. The wait. For the first 3 weeks after submitting my documentation and complaint, nothing happened. No acknowledgement from the compliance department, no contact from the general counsel's office, no indication that anyone was taking my concerns seriously or conducting any kind of review. Catherine mocked me for wasting time on paperwork that nobody's going to read. She said I should be focusing on finding a new job instead of chasing conspiracy theories about why I was fired. She was convinced I was in denial, unable to accept that I'd simply been laid off like any other mid-level corporate employee who wasn't as essential as he thought. Her contempt had evolved from that initial laugh into a constant undercurrent in our conversations. Everything I did was evidence of my inadequacy or delusion. When I applied for jobs, she questioned why I was aiming for director-level positions instead of accepting that I'd probably need to step down to a manager role. When I networked with former colleagues, she suggested they were humoring me out of pity rather than genuine professional respect. I stayed quiet. I didn't argue or defend myself. I focused on my job search, on maintaining my professional network, on documenting my accomplishments and preparing for interviews. And I waited to see if the documentation I'd submitted would lead to anything. In the 4th week, I received a letter from Garrison Financial's general counsel. The letter acknowledged receipt of my complaint and confirmed that the company took all employee concerns seriously. They had referred the matter to an outside law firm to conduct an independent investigation to ensure objectivity and thoroughness. The investigation would review the circumstances of my termination and evaluate whether company policies and procedures had been properly followed. The letter stated that I might be contacted for an interview as part of the investigation, and that I should preserve any documents or communications relevant to my employment and termination. It also included standard language about the company's non-retaliation policy and my right to have legal representation during any investigative interviews. I kept the letter but didn't mention it to Catherine. I wasn't trying to hide it, but I also saw no point in giving her another opportunity to dismiss what I was doing as pointless or delusional. The investigation. The law firm conducting the investigation contacted me 6 weeks after I'd submitted my original complaint to Garrison Financial's ethics hotline and general counsel's office. A lawyer named Sarah Chen called my cell phone one morning and introduced herself as part of an independent investigative team that had been retained by Garrison Financial to review concerns raised about potential policy violations related to my employment termination. She explained that the investigation was being conducted by an outside firm rather than internal company personnel to ensure objectivity and credibility. Garrison Financial's board of directors and general counsel had determined that the allegations I'd raised were serious enough to warrant independent review, particularly given that they involved senior executives, including the CFO and the head of human resources. Sarah asked if I would be willing to participate in a formal interview as part of the investigation. The interview would be recorded and transcribed, and I had the right to have my own attorney present if I wished, though that wasn't required. She emphasized that I was not under any obligation to participate, but that my cooperation would be helpful in allowing the investigators to fully understand the facts and circumstances of my termination. I agreed to the interview without hesitation. This was exactly what I'd been hoping for when I submitted my documentation. A thorough, professional investigation that would examine the facts objectively and determine whether proper procedures had been followed. The interview was scheduled for the following Tuesday via video conference. It lasted nearly 3.5 hours, running from 9 in the morning until almost 12:30 in the afternoon. Sarah was joined by another attorney from her firm, a man named Robert Hayes, and both took extensive notes while recording the entire conversation. They asked detailed questions covering every aspect of my employment history at Garrison Financial and the circumstances of my termination. When had I first joined the company? What were my initial responsibilities? How had my role evolved over 8 years? What was my relationship with Richard Marsh like during the time he was CFO and I reported to him? How would I characterize my performance and contributions to the company? I provided thorough, factual answers to everything, walking them through my career progression, my major projects and accomplishments, my performance reviews, and salary history. I explained that I'd had what I thought was a strong working relationship with Richard, that he'd generally been supportive of my work and had advocated for my promotion to Director of Corporate Strategy 3 years earlier. Then the questions shifted to the more sensitive and relevant topics. When had I first become aware of a personal relationship between Richard Marsh and Jennifer Cho? What had I observed that led me to believe they were involved in an affair? Had I ever discussed this with either of them directly? Had I ever reported it through any company channel? I described the timeline of my growing awareness, starting with small observations in meetings that didn't mean much individually but accumulated into a clear pattern. Richard and Jennifer frequently scheduling meetings together that didn't seem to have obvious business purposes, the way they interacted in group settings, the body language and eye contact that suggested intimacy beyond professional relationships, comments from colleagues who'd noticed similar patterns. Eventually, a former executive assistant who'd worked for Richard and had left the company mentioning to me directly in a private conversation that everyone on the executive floor knew about the affair. I explained that I'd never confronted them because I didn't think it was my place and I didn't want to create unnecessary conflict. I'd never reported it formally because I wasn't sure what the appropriate channel would be and I didn't want to be seen as stirring up trouble or creating drama. But I'd become increasingly uncomfortable as I observed what appeared to be Richard receiving preferential treatment from HR on personnel decisions and policy matters that seemed influenced by his relationship with Jennifer. Sarah asked specifically about the board meeting in August, where questions about conflicts of interest had been raised. Had I been present? What exactly had been said? How had Richard and Jennifer reacted? Did I know who had raised those questions with the board? I confirmed I'd been in the meeting as a note-taker for a separate agenda item about strategic planning. The board members' questions had been general rather than accusatory, asking about company policies for managing potential conflicts of interest among senior leadership and whether proper disclosure and recusal procedures were being followed. But the timing and context had made it clear to everyone in the room that specific concerns must have been raised behind the scenes. The shift around the 10th week after I'd filed my complaint, I received an email from Garrison Financial's general counsel requesting a meeting to discuss resolution options related to my separation from the company. The tone was formal and careful, using language that suggested the company was treating this as a legal matter requiring documented agreements rather than a routine administrative issue. The meeting took place via video conference with the general counsel, Sarah Chen, from the investigating law firm, and a senior HR director I'd never worked with before. They explained that the investigation had identified concerns about the process used to terminate my employment. Specifically, the investigation found that my termination had been recommended by Richard Marsh and approved by Jennifer Cho without adequate documentation of the business justification or proper review by other members of the executive leadership team. Given that both Richard and Jennifer were involved in a personal relationship at the time, this created an apparent conflict of interest that should have required disclosure and recusal from the decision. The investigation also found that the stated reason for my termination, elimination of my position due to strategic restructuring, was not supported by any documented restructuring plan or business analysis. No other positions had been eliminated. My team and responsibilities still existed, just reassigned to other managers. The financial savings from eliminating my role were minimal compared to the company's overall budget and strategic priorities. While the investigation couldn't definitively prove that Richard had terminated me specifically because of my knowledge of his relationship with Jennifer, the circumstantial evidence strongly suggested that personal considerations rather than legitimate business needs had driven the decision. The general counsel said the company wanted to resolve the matter fairly and avoid litigation if possible. They asked if I'd be willing to discuss settlement terms that would address my concerns and the company's desire to close this matter. I said I'd consider a settlement but wanted to understand what they were proposing before committing to anything. They outlined the basic framework: reclassification of my termination, financial compensation, and a neutral employment reference. The specific details would need to be negotiated, but the company was prepared to make a meaningful offer to resolve the situation. I told them I'd think about it and would want to consult with an employment attorney before agreeing to anything. They said that was entirely appropriate, and they'd wait to hear back from me or my counsel. Catherine noticed the change in tone when the general counsel called to schedule that first settlement discussion. I'd put the call on speaker while I was making dinner, and she heard the formal, careful language the lawyer used. She asked what it was about, and I explained briefly that the company was reviewing my termination and wanted to discuss resolution options. Her reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of dismissing it as meaningless corporate bureaucracy, she became quiet and uncertain. She asked if I was going to sue them, if this was going to turn into some big legal battle. I said I hadn't decided what I was going to do, but I was considering my options. For the first time since my termination, she seemed uneasy, like she was realizing that maybe I hadn't just passively accepted being fired, that maybe there was more happening than she'd understood or given me credit for. The outcome: I hired an employment attorney immediately after receiving the general counsel's initial outreach about discussing settlement options. Her name was Maria Gonzalez, and she specialized in executive-level wrongful termination cases with a particular focus on situations involving conflicts of interest and inappropriate use of authority. She came highly recommended from another former Garrison Financial employee who'd successfully negotiated a settlement after being terminated under questionable circumstances 2 years earlier. Maria's initial consultation lasted 2 hours. I walked her through the entire situation from beginning to end: my 8 years at the company, my consistently excellent performance, the affair between Richard and Jennifer, the suspicious timing of my termination, the investigation I'd triggered through my documentation and complaint, and the recent contact from the company about settlement discussions. She reviewed all the documentation I'd submitted to the company, my personnel file with its spotless performance reviews, the timeline I'd compiled showing the correlation between the board meeting and my termination, the sparse and poorly justified termination paperwork, the emails and communications I'd preserved showing my successful project work and positive relationships with colleagues. Her assessment was direct and professional. Based on the evidence I'd provided and the fact that the company was proactively reaching out about settlement, she believed I had a very strong case for wrongful termination. The lack of legitimate business justification for eliminating my position, combined with the documented conflict of interest between Richard and Jennifer and the suspicious timing, created significant liability risk for Garrison Financial. If we went to litigation, a jury would likely find in my favor, and damages could be substantial given my salary level and the reputational harm the termination had caused. However, she also cautioned that litigation would be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. Even with a strong case, employment lawsuits typically took 18 months to 2 years to resolve through the court system. Legal fees could easily exceed $100,000, even if we won and recovered some costs from the defendant, and there was always risk involved in litigation, no matter how strong the case appeared on paper. Given that the company was already offering to settle, Maria recommended we pursue that path aggressively but strategically. She would negotiate for terms that didn't just compensate me financially, but also corrected my employment record and ensured I could move forward professionally without the stain of an unexplained termination following me to every future opportunity. The negotiations began the following week. Maria spoke directly with Garrison Financial's general counsel and with attorneys from the outside law firm that had conducted the investigation. The discussions were professional but firm on both sides, each party understanding the strengths and weaknesses of their position. Garrison Financial's initial offer was straightforward but inadequate. 6 months' salary as a settlement payment, reclassification of my termination to, resignation, and a neutral reference for future employment verification. Total value of approximately $106,000 plus the employment record correction. Maria rejected that offer immediately. She pointed out that 6 months' salary didn't come close to compensating me for the actual and ongoing damage to my career. I'd been unemployed for 3 months already and would likely need several more months to find a position comparable to what I'd lost, given that I was searching for director-level roles that were competitive and required extensive interview processes. The total lost earnings would far exceed 6 months' salary, and that didn't even account for the reputational harm, the emotional distress, or the fact that I'd been wrongfully terminated to protect executives who'd violated company policies. She countered with a demand for 18 months' salary, which would be approximately $320,000, plus correction of my employment record, a positive reference letter signed by the CEO, and a commitment that Garrison Financial would implement additional training and oversight for executives regarding conflicts of interest and appropriate relationship management. She also requested that the company agree to make me whole on any deferred compensation or unvested equity that I'd forfeited due to the termination. The back and forth continued for nearly 3 weeks, multiple rounds of offers and counteroffers, with both sides making strategic concessions while protecting their core interests. Maria kept me informed throughout the process, explaining the reasoning behind each position and asking for my input on what terms mattered most to me. The final settlement came together in late February, approximately 4 months after my original termination. The key components included: first, Garrison Financial agreed to pay me $350,000 as a lump sum settlement. This represented approximately 18 months of my base salary and bonus, compensating not just for the months I'd been unemployed, but also for the likely ongoing impact on my earnings as I reestablished my career. The payment would be made within 5 business days of my signing the final settlement agreement. Second, they agreed to completely reclassify my termination. Instead of position elimination due to restructuring, my personnel file would show separation by mutual agreement to pursue other opportunities. This was critically important because it removed any suggestion that I'd been laid off or that my role hadn't been valuable enough to preserve. Mutual agreement was neutral and common, implying nothing negative about my performance or standing with the company. Third, and equally important for my future prospects, they agreed to provide a detailed reference letter signed by the CEO himself. The letter would confirm my dates of employment, describe my role and responsibilities as Director of Corporate Strategy, highlight specific accomplishments and contributions I'd made during my tenure, and explicitly state that I'd left the company in good standing and would be eligible for rehire if I ever chose to return. They also committed that any future employment verification requests from potential employers would receive this positive information rather than the bare minimum facts that raised red flags. Fourth, The settlement agreement included language requiring Garrison Financial to implement enhanced training and oversight for senior executives regarding conflicts of interest, appropriate management of personal relationships in the workplace, and proper procedures for personnel decisions. The language was carefully worded to avoid admitting any specific wrongdoing, but it signaled clearly that the company had recognized serious problems in how Richard and Jennifer had handled their relationship and its impact on business decisions. In exchange, I had to sign a release waiving any potential legal claims against the company and agreeing to a confidentiality clause that prevented me from discussing the settlement terms publicly. I could tell people I'd reached an agreement with my former employer, but I couldn't disclose the amount or the specific terms. I signed the agreement. The settlement payment was deposited into my bank account 3 business days later. Richard Marsh resigned from Garrison Financial 6 weeks after I finalized my settlement. The company announced it as a retirement, thanking him for his years of service and wishing him well. But people inside the company told me he'd been given a choice: resign quietly or face termination for policy violations related to his relationship with Jennifer and his failure to properly manage conflicts of interest. Jennifer Cho was demoted from Chief People Officer back to VP of Human Resources and placed under closer supervision by the General Counsel's office. She kept her job, but her authority was significantly reduced and her path to further advancement was essentially blocked. The company also quietly settled with at least 2 other former employees who'd been terminated under questionable circumstances during the period when Richard and Jennifer's relationship had been active. I didn't know the details, but the fact that settlements happened suggested the investigation had found a pattern of inappropriate personnel decisions. Personal fallout. Catherine's attitude changed completely after the settlement. When the money hit our bank account, when she saw $350,000 deposited in a single transaction, she realized that I hadn't been delusional or wasting time with pointless paperwork. She tried to act like she'd supported me all along, like her contempt and mockery had been some kind of tough love to keep me grounded. She said she'd always known I was right about being wrongfully terminated, that she'd just been trying to prepare me for the possibility that nothing would come of my complaint. I didn't argue with her, but I also didn't forget how she'd laughed when I lost my job, how she'd treated my termination as confirmation of my inadequacy, how she'd mocked every step I took to document what happened and pursue appropriate channels for addressing it. Her reaction to my job loss had revealed something fundamental about how she saw me and our relationship. When I was successful and earning a high salary, she'd benefited from that and accepted it as normal. But when I faced a setback, instead of providing support or partnership, she'd treated it as an opportunity to diminish me and confirm her apparently long-held belief that I wasn't as capable as I thought. The settlement money didn't change that revelation. It just made her realize she'd been wrong in her assessment and needed to recalibrate how she treated me to maintain access to the financial benefits I provided. We separated 4 months after the settlement. The divorce was relatively amicable because California's community property laws meant she was entitled to half of our assets regardless of how she'd behaved during the crisis. She got half the settlement money, half our savings, and we sold our house and split the proceeds. I could have fought harder, tried to argue that the settlement was compensation for my individual wrongful termination rather than marital property. But my attorney advised me that California courts generally treated employment settlements as community property acquired during the marriage, and fighting it would cost more in legal fees than I'd save. I let it go. The money wasn't worth extending my connection to someone who'd shown me exactly how little she respected or valued me when I needed support most. Ending. I found a new position 6 months after my termination from Garrison Financial. After 4 months of focused job searching, once I'd finalized the settlement and had a clean employment record to present to potential employers. The role was Director of Corporate Development at Technova Systems, a mid-sized technology company that was growing rapidly and needed someone with my strategic and analytical background to help evaluate acquisition targets and expansion opportunities. The base salary was $220,000 with substantial equity compensation that could be worth significantly more if the company continued its growth trajectory and eventually went public or was acquired. The employment verification process with Garrison Financial went exactly as the settlement had specified. Technova's HR department called to verify my employment dates and get a reference, and they received the positive information we'd negotiated: confirmation of my role as Director of Corporate Strategy, acknowledgement of my contributions and successful project leadership, statement that I'd left in good standing to pursue other opportunities, and confirmation that I was eligible for rehire. No red flags, no concerning explanations about restructuring or position elimination, no gaps that needed awkward clarification during interviews. The hiring manager at Technova mentioned casually during my final interview that my reference from Garrison Financial had been particularly positive and detailed, noting that it was unusual for companies to provide that level of specific information rather than just confirming dates and title. He said it gave him confidence that I'd been a valued employee who'd left on good terms, rather than someone who'd been pushed out due to performance issues or interpersonal conflicts. I never told anyone at Technova about what had really happened with Richard and Jennifer and my wrongful termination. It wasn't relevant to my current work or my ability to contribute value in my new role, and bringing it up would only raise questions about why I was still focused on the past instead of the present and future. The settlement agreement included standard confidentiality provisions that prevented me from discussing the specific terms publicly, and I was content to leave that entire chapter of my life closed. But privately, in moments of reflection, when I thought about everything that had happened over those intense 6 months, I found myself returning again and again to the same core lessons and insights about how power works in corporate environments, and how to respond effectively when that power is used against you inappropriately or illegally. The main lesson, the one that shaped how I approached workplace conflicts and career challenges from that point forward, was this: emotional reactions and public confrontations, even when completely justified by the circumstances, weaken your credibility and give your opponents ammunition to dismiss you as irrational, vindictive, or unable to handle professional setbacks with maturity. But careful documentation, formal processes followed with precision and patience, and proper use of institutional channels create a record that organizations must take seriously, because ignoring it creates legal liability and reputational risk they cannot afford. I'd been furious when I was fired, angry at Richard for terminating me to protect himself from scrutiny about his affair, angry at Jennifer for allowing her personal relationship to compromise her professional judgment and enable an unjustified termination, angry at the company for not having better systems in place to prevent senior executives from misusing their authority in such blatant ways. That anger had been justified, understandable, a normal human response to being treated unfairly, and having my career threatened for reasons that had nothing to do with my actual performance or value. But acting on that anger through public accusations, social media posts, or immediate litigation would have been counterproductive. Richard and Garrison Financial had more resources, better lawyers, sophisticated PR capabilities, and institutional authority that I couldn't match as a single fired employee trying to defend his reputation. If I'd gone the confrontational route, they would have portrayed me as a disgruntled ex-employee making unfounded allegations, and most neutral observers would have found their narrative more credible than mine simply because they had the power and platforms to shape perception. Instead, I'd chosen documentation and procedure. I'd requested my personnel file through proper legal channels and reviewed it methodically to understand what evidence existed. I'd compiled detailed timelines and supporting materials that told a story through facts rather than accusations. I'd submitted formal complaints through the company's own ethics systems rather than making public allegations that could be dismissed as revenge or attention-seeking. I'd provided information to independent investigators and answered their questions truthfully and thoroughly rather than trying to spin events to make myself look better. That approach had worked. Not quickly, not dramatically, but systematically and effectively. The investigation had examined the facts and reached conclusions that vindicated my concerns without requiring me to wage a public battle or invest years in litigation. The settlement had provided meaningful compensation and, more importantly, corrected my employment record in ways that allowed me to move forward professionally without permanent damage to my career trajectory. Catherine had laughed when I lost my $200,000 job, treating my termination as confirmation that I'd always overestimated my own competence and value. She'd mocked my decision to focus on documentation and formal complaints instead of immediately moving on or accepting that I'd simply been laid off like any other expendable employee. She'd been convinced I was in denial, unable to accept reality, wasting time on conspiracy theories and paperwork that nobody would care about. She'd stopped laughing when she saw the settlement money deposited in our bank account. $350,000 in a single lump sum payment, more than 5 years of her own annual income, arriving as direct evidence that my quiet, patient approach had been strategic rather than passive, effective rather than pointless. But the money hadn't changed the fundamental truth about our relationship that her reaction to my job loss had revealed. When I'd been successful and earning a high salary, she'd benefited from that financial security and accepted it as normal and deserved. But when I faced an unexpected setback, her first instinct hadn't been to provide support or partnership. It had been to use my vulnerability as an opportunity to express contempt she'd apparently been holding back, to confirm her private belief that I wasn't as capable or valuable as I thought I was, to take satisfaction in seeing me brought down to what she considered my actual level. The settlement money didn't erase that truth or repair the damage to our relationship. If anything, it highlighted how transactional her support had always been, tied to my external success, rather than any genuine partnership or commitment to facing challenges together. I didn't need to argue with Richard or publicly expose his affair with Jennifer. I didn't need to post dramatic accusations on LinkedIn or threaten revenge or make my termination into some kind of public cause. I just needed to document what had happened with precision and thoroughness, submit that documentation through appropriate institutional channels, and trust that people whose professional responsibility was to investigate these matters would do their jobs competently. The investigation spoke for me. It examined the evidence of conflicts of interest, the lack of legitimate business justification for my termination, the patterns of questionable personnel decisions that suggested inappropriate influence. It created consequences for the executives who'd misused their authority, delivered vindication and compensation for me, and did all of this through formal processes that carried institutional authority rather than just my word against theirs. That was the power of documentation and procedure over emotional confrontation. It wasn't dramatic or immediately satisfying. It required patience and discipline and faith that systems would work as designed. But when the facts were clear and properly documented, when formal procedures were followed correctly, institutions acted to protect themselves by addressing problems that created liability. And that created real consequences that lasted longer and meant more than any public accusation or angry confrontation could have achieved. I didn't need to argue or expose anyone. I just needed the truth on record. The investigation spoke for me.